Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we're going to look into the recent social media trend to claim that the Holocaust victim and teenage writer Anne Frank had white privilege, and how we have gone from a world who understood the horrors of the Holocaust to impose current anti-Semitic beliefs into the world's worst act of hate and anti-Semitism. Let's get started. Recently, there's been some controversy on Twitter that the Jewish community is quite angry about. I myself was shocked and appalled at this situation when it was brought to my attention, not only as a Jewish person, and not even as the grandchild of two Holocaust survivors, but more as an historian. The controversy on Twitter, and I guess growing in the world at large, is the debate on whether or not Anne Frank, a young Jewish girl who wrote the infamous diary about her life while hiding from the Nazis in the Netherlands and eventually dying in a Nazi concentration camp, is considered white, and therefore she had what is now commonly known as white privilege. I really hope for my educated listeners this would sound absolutely insane for a few reasons. Most of all, the fact that we're trying to say that a person who had to hide and avoid persecution and death, and eventually died because of her ancestral heritage, had any privilege in her society. It is a complete oxymoronic concept. People on Twitter are suggesting that because Anne Frank was, quote, white-facing, in other words, had a white complexion, that she did not or would not face discrimination or hate in her society, and in fact had some type of advantage in her society because of it. From my general understanding of this idea, it suggests that, unlike minorities with visible characteristics like skin color, Anne Frank was light-skinned and would therefore allow her to hide her minority status, unlike other cultures. Obviously, this concept of Jews not being a visible minority ignores a great deal of facts from World War II Nazi ideology, who clearly believed that there were visible characteristics of Jewish people. The Nazis had clear definitions by law of what a, quote, Jew looked like, sounded like, or acted like. We have seen this issue of Jews not being a visible minority in the modern conversations today. This idea was most famously made on The View by Whoopi Goldberg not that long ago. For more information on that incident, please check out my previous podcast, Whoopi Goldberg's Non-Apology. As we do on this podcast, we want to first go into the history of this Anne Frank debate to better understand the roots of the situation and how we got here. Following World War II, the world saw the horrors of the Holocaust. Nearly all of the countries around the world dealt with, or for the most part, had to come to terms with their own anti-Semitic laws and beliefs. Whether this was almost all major countries around the world declining to take Jewish refugees from the Evian conference before Hitler could murder them, or fascist and Nazi sympathetic movements around the world who praised Hitler and wanted the same to happen in their own countries. One notable group was the German-American Bund, a group of Americans numbering tens of thousands who promoted Nazi ideology in the United States, marching while wearing swastikas and paramilitary uniforms in the streets of America. Or it's in Henry Ford, the head of Ford Motors, that said, quote, "The Jews caused the war. The Jews caused the outbreak of thieving and robbery all over the country." And he ensured the printing and availability of the anti-Semitic work of forgery, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the book that can be credited for starting the idea of a Jewish cabal controlling the world. Ford himself even received a Medal of Honor for his work from Adolf Hitler. After the picture was revealed to the world about anti-Semitism and what it could lead to, governments began cracking down on the activities of the American Bund, and people like Ford began to only speak about their anti-Semitic hateful acts in secret with like-minded colleagues. Thankfully, because of the revelations of the Holocaust, it became socially unacceptable in the Western world to be anti-Semitic. People, for the most part, had empathy for the Jewish people and how the world stood by during an attempted genocide. Following World War II, as often is the case, the world slowly gets back to normal. The Holocaust was a thing of the past, and Jewish people and survivors especially move on with their lives, in a manner of speaking. They moved to countries around the world where they felt more safe and more free to raise their families and practice their faith. Of course, anti-Semitism did not disappear. There were incidents of anti-Semitism, but they were supposed to be rare and out of the norm in the Western world. People who felt negativity towards the Jews and expressed these views were called the fringe. The Holocaust feels like a lifetime ago. In fact, it was so long ago that we see the rise of Holocaust denial in many circles these days. What used to be a supposed fringe idea started to become somewhat mainstream. This could only happen as World War II vets and survivors who saw these camps and death begin to pass away, and all that's left is photographs and testimonies that can be questioned. Initially, Holocaust denial was still a rare and fringe idea, but it becomes somewhat acceptable in Western circles to start questioning the exact numbers or methods. After some time, it became more acceptable to question whether the Holocaust even happened at all. The time where the world once understood what anti-Semitism leads to was over. As the time passed, younger people who had not experienced the impact of World War II began to classify it as old news or even fiction, and as a result, the empathy that the Jews had amongst the West and the rest of the world had faded. Not since the days of the American Bund of the 1920s and 30s have we seen such an open hatred towards Jews like we saw from the political right in Charlottesville 2017. We've seen synagogue after synagogue after synagogue terrorized in America and across the world. Worst of all, we've seen the mainstream media, Fox News for example, openly promote Great Replacement theory, an insane theory that a Jewish cabal of powerful people are trying to bring in immigrants and remove voting power of American whites in order to take over the country. This is ripped right from the pages of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a theory and a broadcast that would make Henry Ford and Adolf Hitler proud. The sounds of, quote, "Jews will not replace us" by the Charlottesville protesters reverberates in my mind like a ticking time bomb. Sadly, we as the Jews around the world are used to seeing this type of hate from the right. We have come to expect it. More shockingly, the left too has fallen into the same trap of forgetting about the Holocaust and allowing themselves to be involved with antisemitism. We see the invention and promotion on the left of this new politically correct form of antisemitism. Even though it's still taboo to be openly anti-Semitic in Western culture, the new state of Israel has become the symbol for the Jews and the Jewish people around the world. Being anti-Israel is okay, even if it's based on less politically correct anti-Semitic ideas. Like the right-wing media, who spread the anti-Semitic hate, we see the left-wing media beat the anti-Israel hypocrisy drum, holding the one Jewish state to a standard that no other state in the Western world or otherwise has ever met. As the former chief rabbi of the UK, Jonathan Sacks, said, in the Middle Ages, Jews were hated for their religion. In the 19th century, they were hated for their race. And today, they are hated for their nation-state, Israel. These are different faces of the same idea, singling out and isolating the Jews. The left and its media rarely speak about the deaths of Jews around the world. The massacre or hostage-taking at Jewish synagogues are always met with brief coverage, filled with "the motive is unknown" on the left-leaning media. Or we can look at the most recent incident in the United States of the mass shooting on July 4th outside of Chicago. This happened to take place in a predominantly Jewish area. Media reports have not shown a reason for this incident. Many Jewish media sources have revealed that this murderer was kicked out of a synagogue weeks earlier in the same area, but I guess the left-leaning media is afraid to call it what it is, anti-Semitism. I am sure it was purely coincidental that the towns and buildings that the killer happened to pick was a synagogue in a well-known Jewish area. At least this is what the left-leaning media wants us to believe, all in a desperate hope to hide the facts of what all Jews in America already know. Anti-Semitism is on the rise once again. Most notable is the media silence or outright manipulation of the continued terrorist acts against Jewish people in the State of Israel. How many stabbings, shootings, bombings of Jewish civilians go completely unreported or manipulated to justify the death of Jews at the hands of terrorists because of the left's newly created idea that Israel and the Jewish people, as an extension, are an oppressor and colonizing people? For more information on the media bias, you can listen to my earlier podcast, Globalizing Antisemitism. It is because of this growing idea on the left that the State of Israel is a colonizing force and an oppressor, and by extension, when Israel is used as a symbol for all Jewish people, that all Jewish people who support Israel's right to exist are oppressors and colonizers as well. As author Barry Weiss says in her book, How to Fight Antisemitism, in order to be welcomed as a Jew in the growing number of progressive groups, you have to disavow a list of things that grows longer each day. Whereas once it was enough to criticize the Israeli government policy, specifically in its treatment of the Palestinians, now Israel's very existence must be denounced. Whereas once Jewish success had to be explained, now it has to be apologized for. And whereas once only Israel's government had to be demonized, now the Jewish movement for self-determination itself has to be demonized. She presents the idea that one is given an ultimatum when trying to be Jewish and take part in progressive movements. Either give up and denounce all that makes you Jewish, or you are barred from participation as an oppressor. The progressive movement has also banned Jewish people from minority groups and even suggests that Jews are not a minority at all. According to the left, the Jews are officially white, but they clean up the language by calling them white-facing, meaning they can appear white and get away as being white in a crowd. Let's think about this rationale for a minute. Of course, this is an oversimplification of the Jewish community, and very ignorant, since not all Jewish people are from European background. About 70% of the Jews living in the State of Israel are not considered white under the Western idea of race. They are not even white-facing, as the left would call them. However, for some reason, these majority non-white people in Israel have been labeled by the left as, quote, white and colonizers over the reestablishing of their ancestral homeland. 15% of Jews in Israel are from African descent, 12% are from the Arab lands, 4% are from the Western Hemisphere, including the Latin American states. How would they even categorize the 40% of Jews in Israel that have been in Israel for generations? This was the first stage in reshaping the history and narrative of the region and demonizing the Jewish people through their symbolic homeland. Barry Weiss makes a very interesting observation about this issue. She points out that throughout history, the Jews as a group have always been transformed by their societies into whatever they hate most, whether it's communists or capitalists or socialists, etc. Right now, she points out, for the left, the worst thing to be is white, so therefore the Jews have become white. The slow chipping away of the world's sympathy for the Jews following the Holocaust is complete, as the right and left have both begun attacking Jews for different reasons. The right has begun getting Holocaust denial into the mainstream media, and the left has begun a campaign to whitewash the Jews and change the history to suggest that the majority non-white Jewish community in Israel is somehow a white colonizer state. When we come back, we will look into this change of the Jewish minority status as a group who have always been targeted for thousands of years is now somehow a privileged non-minority people. We will also look into how Anne Frank has been used as a symbol for this change. When we come back after this break on the Jewish Diaspora Report.